Okay, so we've all heard those stories about the Mozart of something, right? The person who's just naturally brilliant, the one who picks a skill with what seems like zero effort. It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking success is, I don't know, just some kind of gift, something some of us get and some of us, well, just don't. But in this deep dive, we're going to push back against that idea, really dig into it.
Yeah, I'm excited for this.
Me too. So we're diving into Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. And I think this is perfect for our listeners, people who really want to get to the core of things to understand them well. But, without spending hours and hours poring over every single detail, we're going to figure out what actually drives achievement, what really helps people succeed. And I think you'll find the answer is probably not what you'd initially expect.
Exactly. It's really easy to assume that talent is, the thing, the magic bullet. But what Duckworth does so well is she kind of forces us to look beyond that, to see the bigger picture.
Totally. So let's tackle that myth of talent head on. Duckworth kicks things off with a really personal story about her own dad. He was, by his own admission, really worried about how smart his kids were. Like, he was convinced they just didn't measure up intelligence-wise to, like, Einstein, and he was convinced that this was going to hold them back in life.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure to put on a kid.
I know, right? But here's the thing. Years later, Angela Duckworth herself received a MacArthur Fellowship, one of those prestigious genius grants. And she makes a really great point. You don't apply for those. A secret committee of top people in your field decides your work is important, it's creative, it's having a real impact, and they just give it to you. It's not about your IQ, it's about the actual work you're doing.
That's a really powerful point. It really makes you question what we're even talking about when we say someone's a genius. If even someone who receives that kind of recognition from, some of the most respected people in her field wasn't initially seen as, like, exceptionally intelligent, what are we really measuring?
Exactly. And to really explore this idea, Duckworth takes us to West Point. Specifically, that really intense initial training period they have there, Beast Barracks. I mean, this thing is notoriously challenging, designed to weed people out, And for a long time, psychologists were trying to predict which of these incoming cadets, who, are all really promising on paper, which of them would actually make it through Beast.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're investing all that time and resources into training people, you want to have some confidence that they'll actually be able to handle it, right?
Right. So they had all this data on the cadets. They called it the whole candidate score, this kind of weighted average that took into account everything from SAT and ACT scores, high school rank adjusted for class size, even things like leadership appraisals and physical fitness scores. Like, they were admitting people who looked really strong on paper from every angle.
So they had what they thought was a pretty good system for identifying those with the potential to succeed.
Exactly. But here's the thing. It wasn't working. Like, despite all that data, all that careful evaluation, they just couldn't reliably predict who would actually persevere and complete Beast.
Really? So what were they missing?
That's the million-dollar question. But a military psychologist there, Mike Matthews, noticed something really interesting. When cadets dropped out, it rarely had anything to do with, like, a lack of those initial abilities. It wasn't that they weren't smart enough or strong enough or whatever. What he observed was that a key factor was this, like, never give up attitude, this kind of sheer stubbornness to stick it out no matter how tough things got.
So it wasn't necessarily those raw skills, but rather that inner drive to keep going, even when faced with those immense challenges.
Precisely. And this wasn't just a West Point thing. Early on in her research, Duckworth talked to a bunch of really successful people, leaders in all sorts of fields, business, art, music, even athletics. And they kept bringing up this idea that there was something beyond just talent that was essential for reaching the top of their game.
That resonates with a lot of the stories we hear, right? Like, yeah, natural talent can give you a head start, but it's often that relentless drive and commitment that really separates those who achieve greatness from those who just have potential.
Totally. And West Point data really backs this up. Duckworth found that grit was an insanely good predictor of who actually made it through Beast. And get this, the whole candidate scores of the cadets who finished and those who dropped out were basically the same. It didn't matter how high someone scored on all those measures. If they weren't gritty, they were much more likely to quit.
So all those fancy metrics they were using to assess potential were pretty much useless when it came to predicting success in that environment.
Pretty much. And they even repeated the study the next year, same thing. Grit predicted who stayed and who left much more accurately than any of those other factors they were looking at.
That's pretty wild. It really challenges our assumptions about what truly matters when it comes to achievement.
Totally. And this isn't just about military training either. Duckworth looked at data from the Chicago public schools too, thousands of high school juniors. They had them complete a shortened version of her grit scale along with a bunch of other surveys. And what they found was, over a year later, a significant chunk of those students, 12%, hadn't graduated on time.
That's a pretty significant number of kids.
Yeah, it is. And the students who did graduate on schedule, well, they were noticeably grittier than those who didn't. Even more so than things like how much the students cared about school, how conscientious they were, even how safe they felt at school.
That's really interesting. It suggests that this underlying grittiness, this ability to stick with things even when they're tough, might play a much bigger role in academic success than we often realize.
For sure. And the challenges just keep coming, you know? Duckworth then takes us to the training for the Army Special Operations Forces. Those are the Green Berets.
Yeah.
And this is like the elite of the elite, right? Their selection process happens after they've already gone through weeks and weeks of incredibly intense preliminary training.
So they're already starting from a place of like really exceptional ability.
Oh, absolutely. And General James Parker, who was their commanding general, even said outright that this selection course is where they decide who will and who will not make it into the final phase of training. So at this point, you're talking about people who are already incredibly talented, highly trained, super motivated.
So to even be considered for that, they have to have cleared a bunch of incredibly high bars.
Yeah, exactly. But even then, there's still a significant number of people who don't make it. And
Right.
that, Duckworth argues, is because of grit, or I guess a lack of it.
It makes sense. They've already weeded out those who aren't physically and mentally capable, so it has to be something else that separates those who thrive from those who don't, especially at that level of intensity.
Exactly. Now, before Duckworth was formally studying grit as a psychologist, she actually spent some time as a teacher. And it was during that time, even before she learned about things like beast barracks, that she started to realize talent just wasn't the whole story. She saw firsthand that some students, even those who weren't necessarily the most naturally gifted, would excel because they were just so persistent, so determined to learn and improve.
That must have been really eye-opening for her, to see those less talented students surpassing those who seemingly had all the natural ability.
Yeah, it really challenged her assumptions about what it actually took to succeed. And she even made a pretty big career shift herself. She left a really good, probably well-paying job at McKinsey to go into teaching. And as she mentions in the book, some of her former colleagues were pretty confused, to say the least.
It's definitely not the most conventional path, going from a high-powered consulting firm to, a classroom.
No, it's not. But I think it speaks volumes about her own values and, maybe even her own grit, choosing to follow a path that was clearly more meaningful for her personally, even if it wasn't the most obvious or lucrative one.
Totally. It shows a certain level of commitment to something beyond just climbing the corporate ladder.
Right, and it was in the classroom that she encountered students like David Lumong. He was initially put in remedial math. He felt like learning didn't come naturally to him, like he was always playing catch-up. But when he failed a math test, he didn't just shut down or get discouraged. He felt bad, yeah. But then he immediately focused on what he needed to do next. He asked his teacher for help. He went to extra study sessions. He just kept trying. And this really goes against that idea that if you're talented, things should be easy. Even Francis Galton, the guy who really pushed the idea of innate genius, eventually admitted that it actually involved a huge capacity for hard labor.
That's a great point. We often romanticize this idea of effortless talent, but the reality is even those who we perceive as incredibly gifted have often put in a massive amount of work to get there.
Absolutely. And David's story is a perfect example. Even though he didn't feel like a math whiz, his willingness to put in the effort, to ask for help when he needed it, eventually led to some incredible progress. He ended up taking advanced calculus and even got a perfect score on the AP exam. And then he went on to get dual degrees from Swarthmore, a really prestigious college. It's proof that those initial assessments of ability, those placement tests and things, they don't always tell the whole story.
They really don't. And Duckworth argues that when we focus too much on talent, when we hold it up as the be-all and end-all, it can actually do a lot of harm. We overlook those other essential ingredients like grit, and we send this unintentional message that those other qualities just don't matter as much, which is so not true.
Yeah, it's almost like we're setting people up to fail by telling them they either have it or they don't.
Exactly. And to really drive that point home, Duckworth introduces us to Scott Barry Kaufman. He's now a super accomplished academic psychologist. We're talking degrees from Carnegie Mellon, Cambridge, Yale, the whole 9 yards. But get this, when he was a kid, he was put in special education, labeled with a learning disability. He even started to believe he was, quote, hopeless.
Wow. It's hard to imagine someone with those kinds of credentials feeling that way about themselves.
Right. It shows how damaging those labels and those early experiences can be.
Absolutely. But thankfully, Scott's story doesn't end there. Despite that initial setback and that label he was given, he didn't let it define him. He was really involved in all kinds of school activities, Latin clubs, school musicals, choir, you name it. He wasn't necessarily a star at everything, but he was learning, he was growing, he was challenging himself.
So he was really actively engaging with all these different things, despite feeling like he was somehow behind or less than his peers.
Exactly. And it was through all that he started to realize, hey, I'm not hopeless after all.
That's such an important realization to have, especially after being told the opposite for so long.
Totally. And then there's the cello. Scott's grandfather had been a cellist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Scott started taking lessons and found he was actually pretty good at it. He got really, really dedicated to improving, practicing for hours every day. But it wasn't just about like a love for the music. He admits that a big part of his drive came from this deep-seated need to prove to himself and to others that he was intellectually capable.
So it was almost like he was using the cello to disprove that label he had been given, to show everyone that he was smart and capable.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And this whole section of the book with all these different stories really highlights the point that our obsession with talent can distract us from the power of effort. Duckworth even says that as much as talent might matter, effort counts twice.
It's a great way to put it, and it sets us up perfectly for the next big idea we need to explore. The actual power of effort. It's everywhere. It's the thing that pushes us through. And as you said, we use the word talent all the time. Like it's the only explanation for achievement.
It's almost like a default setting, right? Oh, they're just talented.
Yeah.
But then you see these quotes, like the one from the painter Ingres, who said that genius is nothing other than a great aptitude for patience. It really makes you stop and think about what we're actually observing.
It definitely challenges that whole, oh, they were just born with it mentality.
For sure. And Duckworth shares this kind of funny, but also kind of nerve-wracking story about her graduate advisor, Marty Seligman. He's a super accomplished psychologist, like the founder of positive psychology. Anyway, during one of their weekly meetings, he just straight up told her, you haven't had a good idea in 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
And then he followed that up by saying something about how what really matters is fancy footwork, not just good ideas. Basically implying that the actual work you put in is more important than just having some initial spark of brilliance.
That's Marty Seligman for you, straight to the point.
Oh yeah, but I think his point is spot on. It's not enough to just have potential, to have good ideas. You have to be willing to put in the work to actually execute, to see those ideas through.
Absolutely. And that brings us to this really fascinating study that Duckworth talks about, the treadmill test. This was done back in the 1940s at Harvard, and it wasn't just about measuring basic physical fitness. They specifically wanted to see how far people were willing to push themselves before quitting.
Like their mental toughness.
Exactly. They were interested in that tendency to quit before the punishment becomes too severe, as they put it.
Wow, that sounds intense.
Oh, it was. But what's really amazing is that a psychologist named George Villant did this incredibly thorough follow-up study on the guys who took that original treadmill test. He tracked them for decades, collecting all this data on their lives, their work, their relationships, their health, even things like whether they'd sought therapy.
So they had this really comprehensive long-term view of how these guys' lives unfolded.
They did. And the crazy thing is, they found that how long those men stayed on the treadmill back in their college years was actually a better predictor of their overall well-being decades later than any measure of their talent. It was more strongly correlated with their psychological adjustment than anything else.
That's mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
So just being willing to push through discomfort, to persevere when things got tough, actually had this huge impact on their life, years down the line.
It really does make you think about all those everyday moments where we have to choose between pushing a little harder or giving in, It suggests those choices might have bigger consequences than we realize.
Absolutely. And Duckworth even imagines going back to those researchers at Harvard and suggesting they let the guys try the treadmill test again the next day just to see if they could improve, to measure their voluntary effort and their ability to bounce back.
I love that thought experiment. It really highlights that grit isn't just some static thing you either have or don't have. It's about that ongoing choice to push yourself, to keep trying even when it's hard.
Totally. And it's through all these different studies and examples that Duckworth arrives at her definition of grit, which I think is really elegant. She says grit is working on something you care about so much that you're willing to stay loyal to it, to keep at it, even when things get tough. It's about, as she puts it, doing what you love, but not just falling in love, staying in love.
That's such a good way to put it. It's that commitment, that perseverance that really separates grit from just a fleeting passion.
For sure. And if you're looning and wondering how gritty you might be, Duckworth actually provides a condensed version of the grit scale in her book. It's basically a bunch of statements that you rate yourself on, and based on your answers, you get a score that tells you how you compare to, like, the average person in terms of grit.
So it's a way to get a sense of where you stand.
Yeah, exactly. But the important thing is she emphasizes that your grit score isn't set in stone. It can change. It can grow over time.
Which is really encouraging.
Totally. And to really see how grit plays out in the real world, Duckworth introduces us to Jeffrey Gettleman, who was the East Africa bureau chief for the New York Times, won a Pulitzer Prize and everything. She actually knew him back when they were both students at Oxford. And at the time, neither of them had a super clear idea of what they wanted to do professionally.
So he's kind of a poster child for figuring things out as you go.
Right. But Gettleman had this long-term ambition. He wanted to be the East Africa bureau chief for the Times. And he went after it very deliberately, step by step. He started with the student newspaper at Oxford, then did internships at smaller publications, and eventually worked his way up to bigger and bigger news outlets. But it wasn't easy. He even described it as difficult and discouraging and demoralizing and scary.
That's a pretty honest assessment.
Right. But the point is, he didn't give up. He kept pushing, kept learning, kept working his way towards his goal. And in the end, he got there.
So his story is a perfect example of how grit isn't always pretty or glamorous. It's often about, like, slogging through the tough stuff, the boring stuff, the discouraging stuff, but never losing sight of that ultimate goal.
Exactly. So we've seen how talent isn't the only factor, and effort matters a ton. But Duckworth also goes into this idea that it's not just about raw effort, it's about having a clear purpose behind it. She brings up Warren Buffett's famous 3-step process for prioritizing your goals. First, write down all your goals, everything you want to achieve. Then circle your top 5, the most important ones. And then here's the kicker. Make a to-don't list of all those other goals you wrote down.
Yeah, the to-don't list is brilliant. It forces you to actually confront what you're willing to let go of so you can focus on what truly matters.
Totally. But then Duckworth adds this extra step, which I think is really key. She says, ask yourself, to what extent do those top 5 goals serve a common purpose? The idea is to create this hierarchy where all your goals are aligned, driven by the same underlying values and aspirations. When your passion and perseverance are all pointed in the same direction, you're much more likely to actually achieve those big, meaningful goals.
I love that idea. Having that unified purpose, that clear sense of why, makes it so much easier to stay motivated and focused, especially when you hit those inevitable bumps in the road.
Right. It's like having this internal compass that always points you in the right direction.
Right.
Now, here's some good news. You're not stuck with whatever level of grit you happen to have right now. Duckworth actually makes a really strong case that we can cultivate grit, that we can grow it over time. And she starts by reminding us that all human traits, everything from our personality to our intelligence, are shaped by this complex interplay of our genes and our experiences.
Yeah.
She uses the example of height, which I thought was helpful. There's definitely a genetic component to how tall someone will be, but the average height of people in many parts of the world has actually increased dramatically over just a few generations.
Because of things like better nutrition and healthcare, right?
Exactly. So even though there might be some genetic predisposition, our environment and our experiences play a huge role in how those genes actually express themselves.
So it's not just nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture.
Precisely. And Duckworth points out that our personalities, they're not set in stone. They change and evolve over time, mostly as a result of our life experiences. She even talks about how her own career aspirations changed a lot in her 20s, and she eventually found this deep sense of fulfillment from becoming an expert in her field, which came from, years of hard work and dedication.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, the idea that expertise isn't always about some innate gift, but rather the result of like just consistent effort and learning over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And she shares this funny story about a headmaster, a guy named No, whose daughter was notorious for being late, like chronically late for everything. But then she got a job where punctuality was absolutely non-negotiable. You were late, you were fired. Simple as that. And suddenly this girl who had always struggled with being on time was setting multiple alarms, making sure she was never even a minute late. Now even observe that, out in the real world, businesses don't care if a young person thinks they're special or exempt from the rules. They care about results. And when there are real consequences, behavior changes.
It's like a real-world example of how our environment can shape our habits, even those that seem really ingrained.
For sure. Now, Duckworth also gets into the reasons why people quit, why they give up on things. Some of the most common are boredom, that feeling that the effort isn't worth it, not feeling like what they're doing is important, or just that deep-seated belief that they're not capable of succeeding. But she makes a really key point here. Even the grittiest people will still quit sometimes. They'll still give up on certain goals.
Right. It's not about never quitting anything, ever.
Exactly. The difference is they remain really stubborn about their ultimate goals, the ones that truly matter to them. They're willing to let go of those smaller goals, the ones that aren't as essential, so they can focus on the big ones.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about prioritizing, about figuring out what really matters and pouring your energy into that.
Totally. And this brings us to the really actionable part of the book, where Duckworth outlines the 4 psychological assets that we can actually work on to build our grit. These are interest, practice, purpose, and hope. Let's start with interest. We've all heard the follow your passion advice.
Yeah,
right?
it's like a staple of every graduation speech.
Right. And Duckworth acknowledges that it's a nice idea, but it's not always that simple. She even talks about her own father, who had a really successful career at DuPont. But it wasn't like he was some passionate chemist who couldn't imagine doing anything else. He had to make a living, he had a family to support, and he found a path that worked for him, even if it wasn't like his lifelong dream.
So sometimes it's not just about passion, it's about practicality too.
Absolutely. But Duckworth also points out that passion can develop over time. She uses examples like Will Shortz, the puzzle editor for the New York Times, and Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. Both of those guys are known for being super passionate about their work. But it wasn't necessarily love at first sight, They built that passion over time through engagement and hard work and really getting into the nitty-gritty of what they were doing.
I think that's really encouraging. It suggests that we don't necessarily have to have this burning passion from day one to end up loving what we do.
Exactly. And there's actually a lot of research that backs this up. Duckworth talks about studies that have found a really strong link between interest and both happiness and success. Basically, when you find something that really grabs your attention, that you genuinely enjoy, you're much more likely to stick with it and excel at it.
That makes sense. It's hard to stay motivated when you're not interested in what you're doing.
Totally. But here's the thing. Early interest can be really fragile. They need time and nurturing to really develop into something lasting. And nobody, and I mean nobody, is going to put in hours of work on something they find completely and utterly boring.
So how do we cultivate that interest? How do we go from a passing curiosity to a deep and lasting passion?
Duckworth talks about the research of a psychologist named Benjamin Bloom, who studied how world-class performers develop their skills. He found that there are basically 3 phases. The early years, where it's all about discovery and exploration, the middle years, where you start to get more into deliberate practice, and the later years, which are often driven by a strong sense of purpose.
So those early years are really important for laying the foundation, for figuring out what you're actually interested in.
Exactly. And Bloom found that beginners need a lot of encouragement, a lot of freedom to explore, to try things out, to make mistakes. They need those small wins to keep them motivated, and a little bit of praise never hurts,
It's like creating that safe space where they can experiment and learn without feeling like they have to be perfect right away.
Yeah, totally. And think about someone like Will Shortz, the puzzle guy. He got into puzzles early on, but it wasn't like his parents forced him to do crossword puzzles for hours every day. He found a puzzle book he liked, started creating his own, and his mom, she encouraged him, gave him opportunities. She even put a guitar in his room when she noticed he was getting into music.
That's a great example of providing that supportive environment without being overly controlling.
Right. It's about nurturing those natural inclinations, letting kids explore what they're interested in without putting a ton of pressure on them.
And there's also this interesting distinction that a psychologist named Paul Sylvia makes between how beginners and experts experience novelty. For a beginner, pretty much anything new is novel and exciting, right? But for an expert, that novelty comes from the subtle nuances, the deeper levels of understanding, the more complex challenges within their field.
That makes sense. You're not going to be engaged by the same things once you've already mastered the basics.
Exactly. And that's actually why experts can stay so passionate about their work for so long. They're constantly finding new challenges, new layers of complexity to explore.
I love that. And Duckworth even shares this personal anecdote about how she realized she wasn't actually improving as a runner because her routine had become so monotonous. She wasn't pushing herself. She wasn't tracking her progress. She was just going through the motions. It's a great example of how we sometimes need to go beyond just showing up to really develop and maintain that interest.
Yeah, it's about staying engaged, finding those ways to keep things challenging and exciting.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second psychological asset, practice. And this isn't just about putting in the hours, it's about how you practice.
Like the quality of the practice matters more than the quantity.
Exactly. Even someone like David Blaine, the magician who does those insane endurance stunts, talks about how his abilities come from tons and tons of practice, of pushing himself beyond his comfort zone, of constantly experimenting and refining his techniques. It's not magic, it's grit.
I love that example. It really demystifies this idea of talent.
It really does. And Duckworth also delves into this study on National Spelling Bee champions. And what she found was that what set those kids apart wasn't just that they read a lot or played word games, it was their commitment to deliberate practice.
Right.
This is like solitary, focused, intense practice where they're memorizing words, breaking down their etymologies, really drilling down deep into the material.
So it's not just passive engagement, it's active, focused effort.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this kind of practice is actually different from that flow state that a lot of people talk about. You know, that feeling where you're completely absorbed in what you're doing, time seems to disappear, and you're performing at your absolute peak.
Oh yeah, flow is great. Who doesn't love being in flow?
Right. But a former spelling bee champ named Carrie Close actually said that she only really experienced flow during the easier rounds of the competition when she wasn't being challenged as much. It was the hard work, the deliberate practice that was the most rewarding, even if it wasn't always effortless or blissful in the moment.
So it's like, flow is great for performance, but deliberate practice is what gets you to that level of performance in the first place.
And they both have their own kind of satisfaction, right? Flow is about that feeling of effortless mastery, while deliberate practice is about the joy of getting better, of pushing yourself beyond your limits.
I like that distinction. And it leads us perfectly to the third psychological asset, purpose. Duckworth talks about how psychologists often differentiate between two types of happiness. There's hedonic happiness, which is all about pleasure and immediate gratification. And then there's eudaimonic happiness, which comes from having a sense of meaning and purpose in your life.
So enjoying the moment versus feeling like your life has a larger meaning.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that research has shown that people who score high on grit also tend to be more driven by a sense of purpose. Like they find their motivation in contributing to something bigger than themselves, something that makes a difference in the world.
So it's not just about working hard for personal gain or recognition. It's about feeling like your efforts are connected to something more meaningful.
Right. And this connects to Amy Rosniewski's work on how people view their jobs. She found that some people see their work as just a job, a way to pay the bills. Others see it as a career, a path for advancement and achievement. But then there's this third group who see their work as a calling.
Like it's an essential part of who they are, almost like a mission in life.
Exactly. And it turns out that the people who see their work as a calling are significantly grittier than those who see it as just a job or even a career.
That makes sense. If you feel like you're fulfilling some deeper purpose through your work, it's going to be much easier to stick with it when things get tough.
Totally. And the great thing is, Wisniewski argues that a calling isn't necessarily something you just stumble upon. It's something you actively create, something you cultivate, by looking for those connections between your work and the bigger picture, the people you're serving, your own values. She uses that classic example of the bricklayer who realizes he's not just laying bricks, he's building the house of God.
Such a powerful shift in perspective. And we see this same idea play out in Michael Kearney's story. He's a doctor who initially focused on just prescribing medications, but he realized that a lot of his patients needed something more, so he started a meditation class to help them connect with their lived experience on a deeper level.
And that program has become hugely successful, really making a difference in people's lives.
It shows that even within a seemingly traditional profession, you can find ways to inject purpose and meaning. to connect your work to something that truly resonates with you. Absolutely. And Bill Damon, a researcher who studied purpose in adolescence, found that everyone, even teenagers, have a purpose, even if they're not fully aware of it yet. He defines purpose as the answer to that fundamental question: why are you doing this?
Like, what's the driving force behind your actions, your choices, the way you spend your time and energy?
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Duckworth tells this really inspiring story about Kat Cole, who went from growing up in poverty to becoming the president of a huge bakery chain. She had this amazing drive to help others, even from a young age. When she was a hostess at a restaurant, she wasn't just standing there waiting for tables. She was actively jumping in to help her coworkers, to do whatever needed to be done, not just to get bigger tips, but because she genuinely cared. And that attitude led her to learn and advance quickly, ultimately leading to her incredible success.
Her story is such a testament to how a strong sense of purpose, even from a young age, can really propel you forward.
Totally. Now, the final psychological asset Duckworth covers is hope. And this one is really important. She talks about Martin Seligman's research, the guy who founded positive psychology. Early on in his career, he did this really famous study on learned helplessness in dogs, where he basically found that when dogs were repeatedly exposed to uncontrollable shocks, they eventually just gave up and stopped trying to escape, even when they had the opportunity.
That's so sad, but it makes sense, you know? If you feel like you have no